Hi, Ms. Johnson. Welcome to my ToK Oral presentation titled The Freedom of a Puppet, Free Will, Ethics, and Reason. So, when browsing through news articles on CNN's website, one headline in particular struck me as intriguing. It read, "Most Hated Man in America Goes on Trial. Martin Shkreli fraud trial begins next week." The article went on to outline accusations leveled against the former pharmaceutical executive, who will be on trial for fraud, accused of cheating investors out of $11 million via a Ponzi scheme. He's also infamous for increasing the price of Daraprim, a life-saving drugs for AIDS patients, from only $13.50 to $750 as the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. The article also outlines his rather eccentric behavior outside his professional dealings, describing lavish purchases and offhand comments about imbecile lawmakers during his congressional hearing, all while live-streaming for hours from his apartment, accompanied by his pajamas and a guitar. This collection of admittedly peculiar, if not malicious and grotesque behavioral patterns, led me to question the nature of our behavior as humans. Who, when entirely free to behave as one chooses to, would behave in such a manner? What kind of ethically and intellectually capable person would behave with such malice, only to spend his free time nonchalantly streaming in his pajamas, accompanied by a guitar and the phone calls of his supporters? And so the knowledge question that resulted was, to what extent is empirical knowledge a reliable depiction of our reality? So his behavior as presented by the CNN article is an interesting case study when considering the existence, or lack thereof, of free will in our human experience. It is easy for most to assume that we have such a freedom when examining our everyday experiences as rational actors who behave in typically reasonable ways. We choose to have juice in the morning because that is our preference, and we choose to go to school because we are required to, and there are consequences if we do not. We usually converse with our parents at some point during the day because we are interested in their well-being. There are evident, straightforward, and reasonable explanations for much of our behavior. However, does the behavior of Martin Shkreli also attest to such a freedom? Who would choose to behave in such a way, given such intelligence and wealth that he possessed? Who would exercise their freedom of will in such a way as to behave as he did? What is a reasonable explanation, if one is available, for the choices that he made? A case like Shkreli's is considered by some, however, to be evidence in favor of the existence of free will. Humans are intrinsically irrational and foolish, and demonstrably squander the opportunities that are given to them in favor of short-sighted indulgences and pleasures. This is the result of our freedom, they would say. This sort of reasoning is not, however, supported by many of the findings of neuroscience and psychology, which support a deterministic view of human behavior. Determinism is the notion that all human behavior is in fact determined to occur in a certain way, and that the freedom most of us claim to possess is illusory. Our behavior is a result of often predictable, certainly perceivable in advance, biochemical processes in the brain, many of which occur in the unconscious. Determinism is quite uncontroversial in neuroscience, and the truth of this notion will be further supported and then presupposed throughout the presentation. Thus, we will assume that humans, objectively speaking, do not possess any freedom of will and are not the conscious authors of their thoughts or actions. The question then becomes, given the evidence in favor of determinism, is our subjective evidence as humans any different? Does our subjective experience in fact attest to freedom of will, or is the illusion of free will in fact an illusion itself? This is how I arrived at the more general question surrounding the accuracy of our senses in relaying to us knowledge about the world. So there are two fundamental ways to approach the question of free will. One would be the anti-free will position, the other being compatibilism, the notion that free will is compatible with determinism. Both conceptions accept the truth of determinism, the position that human behavior is inevitable, and is the result of either chance, random processes in the brain, or prior events, genetics, and environment. It is generally accepted by nearly all neuroscientists and psychologists that this is true. There are several ways of demonstrating this at a biochemical level, but those are likely too complex to discuss here. To address the primary knowledge question, we can first explain why the popular conception of free will is flawed, and then how various philosophical interpretations of our subjective experience can be fitted to what is our objective reality. Sam Harris, a philosopher and neuroscientist, perceives the popular conception of free will as resting on two assumptions. The first one being that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past, and the second being that we are the conscious source of our thoughts and actions. Objectively, there are ways to refute those two assumptions, each with a neuroscience study that was completed using fMRI machines. To the assumption that we could have behaved differently than we did in the past, there are multiple studies demonstrating that this is untrue. One of them was completed by Henk Arts, Ruud Kusters, and Hans Marian, and they demonstrated that you can actually be unaware of the factors that reliably influence your behavior at the conscious level. This was demonstrated using a psychological mechanism known as priming, where participants in the study were exposed to stimuli very briefly so as to allow the subconscious to process the information and not the conscious part of the brain. They were then instructed to squeeze an object that would measure the force being exerted upon it over a period of 4 seconds. The stimuli was comprised of words relating to physical exertion, vigorous exertion, etc. And it was shown that those who were primed using these words actually exerted over twice as much force onto the object and maintained that additional force for the duration of the experiment. Such examples exist across the field of psychology, all of which demonstrate our unawareness of the factors that contribute to our behavior, none of which being within our control. It is thus not possible to say that we could have acted in any way other than the way in which we did, as many observable phenomena subconsciously produce similar, if not identical, patterns in behavior amongst different people. In what sense are we free if we are at the mercy of our unconscious mind and of the factors that influence it? If it is possible for external stimuli presented to us by other humans to reliably cause us to act in a specific way, how can we make a claim to freedom of will? It follows through other findings of neuroscience that these behaviors also correspond to specific biochemical processes that occur in the brain irrespective of our sense of self, or our claim to free will. To the subsequent assumption that we are the conscious authors of our thoughts and actions, there are multiple studies that also demonstrate the falsity of this claim. Many of these magnetic imaging studies demonstrate that the brain in fact makes a decision of any sort many seconds before you, as an individual, are consciously aware of it. In the case of J.D. Haynes' study, he had a participant choose between 2 buttons to press and then to identify, according to a clock, a series of letters that appeared on the screen one at a time, when it was they decided which button they wanted to press. Here it was demonstrated that it could be seen within the brain which button was going to be chosen 7 to 10 seconds before the participant claimed to have decided consciously. This demonstrates without a doubt, along with other studies relating to other types of decisions, that you in fact make up your mind in an area of your brain that is not available to your conscious self. Could there be more convincing evidence that you do not in fact choose but you choose? Your decisions are entirely a product of external and internal factors, none of which are within your control as an individual. For you to be the author of your thoughts, you would in fact have to think them before you think them, and this is the underlying argument against free will. Thoughts simply emerge in consciousness. You are not responsible for your thoughts, nor are you responsible for the resulting desires and intentions. You thus cannot be free to act in any way at any time. It is now important to address the issue of our subjective experience of free will, as this is the subject of our knowledge question. One may argue that we feel free to behave in any way, and so that is what our senses relate to us. At any moment, we feel as if we could choose to do anything, and yet we know, objectively, that that is not true. How can we reconcile our subjective experience with reality? Sam Harris would argue that a more profound attempt at introspection can dispel this illusion. If one pays close attention to the process of thinking, you can perceive quite acutely that you are not the author of your thoughts or your intentions. You are aware of when a thought enters your mind, but you are not responsible for it, nor do you author it. Similarly, when you decide to act upon a desire, you are doing no more than responding to your body's desires. Your decision to act upon it is an impulse that arises in your consciousness that you do not choose to accept. In doing so, Sam Harris describes this experience as discovering that the illusion of free will is in fact an illusion itself. There is, however, a counter-argument to this interpretation of determinism. Philosopher Daniel Dennett, whilst accepting the truth of determinism, does not conclude that it is antithetical to free will. He simply redefines free will in order to reconcile it with the truth of determinism. The compatibilists essentially define free will as the state of being free from duress when making a decision. They argue, subsequently, that you are in fact the totality of your parts. The conscious self is not necessarily the real self, and so it is not necessary to alienate yourself from your neurological processes and unconscious elements. They are as much a part of you as anything. I do not personally find this compelling. When we speak of free will, if it means anything, it is to have conscious authority over your decisions. It is to be aware of when you decide something and why you decide it. I do not consider myself responsible for the production of red blood cells in my body, nor do I consider myself responsible for the thousands of other processes that occur in my body without my knowing, in the same way that I considered myself responsible for my thoughts and actions prior to my inquiry into this area of philosophy and neuroscience. I considered Dennett's argument to be a bait and switch, a change of the subject. Now, this should spawn another knowledge question. And indeed it does. And what follows is objective scientific knowledge inherently more valuable than subjective experience acquired through our senses? Now we can move into how exactly these conclusions about free will actually affect our real life situation and beyond into our real life. So we are at bottom a victim and a product of our own genes and of our environment. Even our capacity for effort and perseverance is either something we have or something we do not. It cannot be said of a lazy person that he is responsible for his own troubles because it was his decision not to work. Your capacity or willingness to work hard is entirely the product of either your genes or your environment. And you must consider yourself fortunate if you have the capacity to work along with the intelligence to do so efficiently and capably. You cannot take credit for your achievements, nor should you be ashamed of your mistakes. The only sensible thing to do in light of this reality is to attempt to replicate good behaviors and eradicate bad ones. Thus, it cannot be said that Martin Shkreli is responsible for his actions, but rather it must be said that he is only a victim of circumstance, the circumstance of his birth to particular parents and particular genetics, and of his environment. This realization that free will is popularly conceived has numerous implications, is false, has numerous implications both ethically and politically. They are all related to the following notion, that all efforts with regards to bettering the human condition must be accomplished by removing the notion of individual responsibility for previous actions and including the notion of fostering beneficial behavior for future ones. In short, they are the following. On a personal level, one must drop any sense of pride or vanity for its own sake, and appreciate that any success is due to our genes and our environment. We must be aware of the fact that our brains are malleable and be more sensitive to the quality of the stimuli we consume. We must expand the breadth of our ethical influences to better our own behavior. We must also avoid any sense of shame. There is no reason to be ashamed of our genetics, nor of our environment, as both are beyond our control. Thus, so are our choices. Dwelling on the past is only useful insofar as it allows you to improve yourself. On a political level, the most important element that would be influenced would be our justice system. How do we deal as a society with criminals and sociopaths who have no regard for the well-being of others? Retribution must be done away with for its own sake. Given the absence of free will, criminals do not deserve to be punished. Rehabilitation must be emphasized in every case. Imprisonment is only justified when rehabilitation is impossible, and an individual is determined to be a threat if not in prison. Punishment is only justified if it can be determined that it will be a deterrent to others who would otherwise have committed that crime. When the lack of punishment can cause misery to those affected by the crime, it can also be, however, this is a caveat, justified to punish victims or punish perpetrators of a crime when those who are affected by the crime would be miserable, following utilitarian model of ethics. And so there are cases where those who are the loved ones of someone who is a murder victim would suffer great duress and stress were the perpetrator of that crime not punished. And so in this case, following a utilitarian model of ethics, it could be considered ethical and necessary to punish a victim of a crime without deeming him personally responsible. However, in many cases, in political life, it can be helpful to encourage people to retain a sense of personal responsibility in order to foster more autonomous behavior and avoid reliance on others and on government. This sort of thinking cannot, however, be applied to our justice system, as the livelihood of thousands of people is at stake. And finally, we return to the primary knowledge question. To what extent does perceived knowledge relayed to us by our material senses a reliable depiction of reality, or to what extent is empirical knowledge a reliable depiction of reality? This has been answered throughout the presentation, essentially in saying that although our senses can be misleading, they can often provide us with sufficient information if we simply look hard enough. The degree to which we scrutinize and analyze our subjective experience is the degree to which it is useful in terms of improving our well-being. Thank you.